The key didn't belong to our house. I knew that the second it slid out of my husband's coat pocket and landed on the kitchen floor with a soft, guilty clink. It was thinner than ours, silver instead of brass, with a chipped blue plastic cap on the top. Not the kind of thing you forget about, not the kind of thing you explain away. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it like it might speak first. Behind me, the kettle screamed itself empty, shrill and angry, steam fogging up the window above the sink. The smell of burnt metal filled the kitchen, but I didn't move. My hands were cold. My chest felt tight, like I'd swallowed something sharp. That was the night I finally understood why my husband had missed our daughter's last 3 birthdays. Before that key, my life had been ordinary in the way that feels safe. I was married to a man named Thomas for 23 years. We had one daughter, Grace, who was 19 and halfway through her first year of college. We lived in a beige 2-story house at the edge of town, the kind of neighborhood where people waved but didn't stop, where lawns were cut on Saturdays and garbage went out on Thursdays. Thomas worked in logistics, nothing glamorous. He wore pressed button-down shirts and steel-toe shoes, smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. I worked part-time at the public library, shelving books and helping elderly patrons figure out how to send emails. Our life wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was dinners at 6:30, reruns playing softly in the background, me reminding him to take his vitamins. It was predictable. And I trusted him. The birthdays started slipping by quietly. The first one was Grace's 17th. He called that morning from the road, apologetic, said a shipment had been delayed. He promised to make it up to her. We still had cake, still had candles. Grace laughed it off with that practiced teenage shrug that pretends not to care. The second was my own. I remember setting the table that night, lighting the cheap vanilla candle I only used for special occasions. I remember glancing at the clock every 10 minutes, the food cooling slowly while I told myself not to be dramatic. When he finally came home close to midnight, he smelled like someone else's cologne. "Long day," he said, kissing my cheek too quickly. I told myself exhaustion could smell like anything. By the third birthday, Grace's 19th, something inside me had already started to fold in on itself. He texted that afternoon, "Can't make it. I'm so sorry." That night, Grace cried quietly in her room. I sat on the edge of her bed and brushed her hair like I used to when she was little, my chest aching with a kind of helpless rage I didn't yet know where to place. Thomas came home late again. He didn't ask about the cake. I wanted to confront him. I rehearsed speeches in my head while folding laundry, while washing dishes, while staring at the ceiling at night. But every time I opened my mouth, he looked so tired, so worn thin, and I loved him. That's the part people don't like to hear, how love makes you complicit in your own blindness. The key appeared on a Tuesday. I had picked up Thomas's coat to hang it in the hallway closet. It was heavier than usual, tugging at my wrist as I lifted it. When I reached into the pocket, expecting to find crumpled receipts or spare change, my fingers brushed cold metal instead. The key fell. It bounced once, rolled, stopped near my foot. I picked it up slowly. It wasn't for our house. It wasn't for our car. It wasn't for his office. I knew every key we owned. I labeled them in my head like a mother does: garage, shed, mailbox, spare. This one had no place in our life. When Thomas came downstairs an hour later, I was sitting at the kitchen table with the key laid flat between my palms. "What's this?" I asked. He froze. Just for a second, barely noticeable, but after 23 years, I knew his pauses the way I knew his laugh. "That?" he said. "Oh, that's nothing, just a spare." "A spare to what?" I asked. He cleared his throat. "A storage unit." "For what?" My voice surprised me. It didn't shake. He shrugged. Work stuff. I nodded. That was it. No argument, no tears. I nodded like a woman who had no reason not to believe her husband. But later that night, while he slept beside me, his back turned, I lay awake listening to the soft rasp of his breathing and thought about how keys are only useful when there's a door you don't want someone else opening. The next morning, I took the key with me. I slipped it in the small pocket of my purse, the one I rarely used. It sat there, heavy and insistent, all day at the library. I reshelved books, smiled at strangers, answered questions about printer jams, all while that key pressed against my hip like a secret that refused to stay quiet. By the time my shift ended, I knew I wasn't going home. I was going to follow the key. I didn't tell Thomas where I was going. That felt important. The silence, the small rebellion of it. I drove past our street without slowing down, the familiar houses blurring together like they always had. Only now they felt like scenery from a life I wasn't sure belonged to me anymore. The key sat in my purse, tapping softly against my wallet every time I turned. The sound made my heart race. I hadn't decided where I was going yet. I only knew I couldn't go home. I pulled into a grocery store parking lot and sat there with the engine running, watching people load bags into their cars, watching a woman wrestle a toddler into a car seat while talking on her phone. Normal life, the kind I thought I had. I took out the key and turned it over in my fingers. The blue plastic cap was worn smooth, like it had been used often, not something that lived forgotten at the bottom of a pocket. Someone had turned this key again and again, careful enough not to lose it, careless enough to bring it into my house. I thought about the nights Thomas came home late, his shirt wrinkled in unfamiliar ways, the times he showered immediately, saying he didn't want to bring work grime into the bed, the way he'd stopped leaving his phone face up on the coffee table. I had noticed all of it. I just hadn't allowed myself to name it. By the time I left the parking lot, the sky was already bruising into evening. I drove toward the newer side of town, instinct more than logic guiding me. Thomas's work took him all over, but there were only so many places you'd hide a second life. Somewhere quiet, somewhere no one from our circle went. I found it on the third try. A low, pale apartment complex tucked behind a row of medical offices. No sign out front, just a small number painted on a stone pillar. The kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. I parked across the street and sat there for a long time, watching. Nothing happened at first. Cars came and went, ordinary and anonymous. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I would laugh about this later, tell Grace how her mother almost turned into a detective over a spare key. But then I saw Thomas's car. It turned into the lot like it belonged there. I felt something drop in my stomach, a physical sensation, heavy and final. My hands tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. I watched as he parked, stepped out, and glanced around before heading toward the building. He didn't look lost. He looked practiced. I followed at a distance I didn't know I was capable of maintaining. Every instinct in me screamed to turn around, to preserve whatever version of my marriage still existed. But another part of me, quieter, steadier, insisted I keep going. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old carpet. My shoes sounded too loud against the floor. I stopped at the end of the corridor and watched as Thomas unlocked a door halfway down. With my key, he went inside without hesitation. I stood there, my breath shallow, my chest burning. I counted to 10, to 20, to 30. Then I walked to the door. My hand shook as I fit the key into the lock. It turned easily, like it had been waiting for me. The apartment was small, clean, too clean. A couch, a small table with 2 chairs, a framed photo on the wall, not of Thomas, but of a little girl missing her 2 front teeth, her smile wide and unashamed. I recognized the shape of Thomas's shoulders before I saw his face. He was standing in the kitchen, pouring juice into a plastic cup. There was a child's backpack hanging on the chair behind him. "Thomas?" I said. The sound of my voice felt unreal in that room. He turned slowly. When he saw me, his face drained of color. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "I could ask you the same thing," I said. He set the cup down too hard. Juice sloshed onto the counter. "It's not what you think," he said, because of course he did. I walked past him, my eyes taking in details I hadn't prepared myself for. A woman's sweater folded on the arm of the couch, pink hair ties on the coffee table, a crayon drawing taped to the fridge. A life. A whole life. "How long?" I asked. He rubbed his face with both hands. "It's not what you think." I laughed then. I couldn't help it. The sound startled both of us. "Don't. Just don't." A door opened behind us. "Daddy?" The voice was small, curious. A little girl stepped into the room. She couldn't have been more than 5. She looked at me with open interest, her head tilted slightly to the side. And then a woman appeared behind her. She was younger than me, not by decades, but enough. She had tired eyes and a guarded posture, the kind you develop when life has already taught you to expect disappointment. She looked from Thomas to me, understanding blooming slowly across her face. "You didn't tell me she'd come," she said quietly. "I didn't know she would," he replied. I knelt down in front of the little girl without thinking. "What's your name?" I asked gently. "Lily," she said. My heart cracked in a place I hadn't known was vulnerable. I stood. "Happy birthday," I said to Thomas, my voice steady and cold. "To all the ones you missed." He reached for me, but I stepped back. "I'll let you explain this to Grace, or I will." I turned and walked out before he could answer. Outside, the air felt sharp in my lungs. I leaned against my car and finally let myself cry. Quiet, broken sobs that left me shaking. But even then, something inside me was already shifting. Because the betrayal wasn't just the affair. It was the years, the lies, the birthdays, and the daughter he never told me about. I didn't drive home right away. I couldn't imagine walking into our kitchen with its familiar smells and routines, knowing what I knew now. I sat in my car with the engine off, listening to the ticking as it cooled, my forehead resting against the steering wheel. Every memory I had of the past 5 years replayed itself, rearranging into something uglier. Missed birthdays, late nights, sudden business trips. Lily. I whispered her name out loud, testing it. It tasted bitter and sweet at the same time. None of this was her fault, and somehow that made it worse. When I finally went home, the house felt hollow, like a place abandoned in a hurry. Thomas wasn't there. His shoes were gone from the entryway. His toothbrush still stood in its cup, accusing in its normalcy. I sat at the dining table and waited. Hours passed. The clock ticked loudly in the silence. I didn't cry anymore. I felt empty, scraped clean of tears. When Thomas came back, it was well past midnight. He stopped short when he saw me. "You told her," he said. "No," I replied. "I told you to." He exhaled, sinking into the chair across from me like his bones had softened. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." That's what people say when they mean it went exactly as far as they wanted, I said. He winced. The truth came out slowly, dragged into the light one sentence at a time. He had met her name was Emily, 7 years ago at a conference. She'd been newly pregnant, newly abandoned. He said he'd helped her out of kindness at first, then obligation, then love. She needed me, he said. So did your daughter, I replied. He flinched at that. Lily was his. He said it quietly, like a confession whispered into a church booth. He had known from the beginning. He'd paid for the apartment, paid for preschool, showed up when he could. And the birthdays? I asked. He looked down. Emily works nights. That's when Lily's awake. The room felt like it was tilting. You chose, I said, over and over. You chose her. I chose both, he insisted weakly. I stood up. My legs trembled, but my voice didn't. You chose yourself. The next day, I told Grace. That was the hardest part. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her college hoodie pulled tight around her, her hair in a messy bun. She listened without interrupting, her face slowly losing color as I spoke. So he has another kid, she said finally. Yes. So he missed my birthdays for her? Yes. She nodded once, then she stood and went to her room. I heard the door close. Lock. I didn't follow her. Some betrayals are private. Thomas moved out 2 days later. He packed quietly, efficiently, like someone who'd practiced leaving before. He took his clothes, his laptop, a framed photo of Grace from when she was little. He left behind the rest. I don't want to hurt you, he said at the door. I met his eyes. That ship sailed. After he left, people began to notice. Neighbors asked polite questions. Friends hesitated before speaking. Grace stopped answering his calls. Emily sent me a long message I didn't read. The truth leaked out anyway. It always does. At the grocery store, a woman I knew from PTA stared at me with a mixture of pity and curiosity. At work, a coworker hugged me too tightly. Word traveled fast in a town that pretended it didn't gossip. Thomas's life began to fracture. Emily wanted more. Grace wanted nothing to do with him. His colleagues started treating him differently once the rumors reached work. And Lily, sweet, innocent Lily, was caught between adults who had failed her before she even knew the words for it. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It was addressed to me in careful handwriting. Inside, Emily apologized. She said she didn't know Thomas was still married at first. She said she was tired. She said Lily asked about me. I folded the letter slowly and placed it in the drawer with the spare batteries and old instruction manuals. I wasn't ready to be generous yet, but I was ready to stop being quiet. Silence had been my default for most of my marriage. I was good at it, at swallowing questions, at smoothing rough edges, at telling myself that peace mattered more than truth. But after Thomas left, silence stopped feeling like protection. It felt like permission, and I wasn't willing to give him any more of that. I didn't scream. I didn't call his mother. I didn't show up at his job. Instead, I started paying attention. There were things Thomas had always handled, the finances, the insurance paperwork, the long-term savings. I trusted him with it the way you trust someone with your back turned. Now, with the house too quiet and my nights stretched long, I opened drawers I'd never opened before. I sat at the dining table with a stack of folders and a cup of tea that went cold beside me. The picture came together slowly. There were withdrawals I didn't recognize, transfers that lined up neatly with rent payments, a second phone plan, preschool tuition, medical bills. He hadn't just built another life, he'd funded it with the one we shared. I felt the anger then, not hot and wild, but sharp and focused, the kind that clears your vision instead of clouding it. I made copies of everything. When Thomas called a week later, I let it ring until voicemail. When he texted, I waited hours before replying, keeping my responses short and factual. It unsettled him, I could tell. "What do you want?" he finally asked when we spoke. "I want honesty," I said, "and I want fairness." He scoffed softly. "You're acting like this was all a calculation." "It became one when you started paying for it with my future," I replied. We met at a cafe halfway between our houses, neutral ground, public enough to keep us civil. He looked older than I remembered, smaller, like a man who had finally realized he couldn't keep all his lies spinning at once. "I didn't think you'd dig like this," he admitted. "I didn't think I'd have to," I said. I laid out the numbers calmly, the savings account, the retirement contributions he'd paused without telling me, the money diverted to Emily's apartment. "This affects Grace," I said, "and it affects me." He nodded, his mouth tight. "What are you asking for?" I had thought about that question for days. "I'm asking for accountability," I said, "and a divorce that reflects reality, not the story you tell yourself." The legal process was slow and exhausting, but it grounded me. Paperwork has a way of stripping emotion down to facts. Thomas couldn't charm his way out of balance sheets and timelines. Grace came home one weekend, her eyes guarded, her voice flat. She didn't ask about her father. She helped me clean out the garage instead, working side by side in companionable silence. "I'm not mad at you," she said suddenly, not looking at me. "I know," I replied. "I just don't know who he is anymore." Neither did I. The town's whispers grew louder. Someone shared a photo of Thomas and Emily at the park. Someone else mentioned Lily at school pickup. The story took shape without my input, and for once, I didn't rush to correct it. Emily reached out again. This time, I answered. We met at a small playground on a weekday morning. Lily ran toward the swings, her laughter bright and unburdened. Emily stood awkwardly beside me, her hands clasped together. "I didn't plan this," she said quietly. "I know," I replied, "but we're both living with it." She looked at me, eyes wet. "He told me you knew, that you were okay with it." I closed my eyes briefly. That sounds like him. We talked, not as rivals, not as friends, but as two women bound by someone else's choices. I told him what Thomas had cost us. She told him what he had promised her. Neither of us got what we were sold. "I won't keep her from him," she said, nodding toward Lily, "but I won't lie for him either." "Good," I said. "She deserves better than that." When I got home, I felt lighter than I had in weeks, not because things were fixed, but because I was no longer alone in the truth. That night, I slept deeply for the first time since the key fell on my kitchen floor. The next day, I told Grace. That was the hardest part. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her college hoodie pulled tight around her, her hair in a messy bun. She listened without interrupting, her face slowly losing color as I spoke. "So he has another kid," she said finally. "Yes." "And he missed my birthdays for her?" "Yes." She nodded once, then she stood and went to her room. I heard the door close, lock. I didn't follow her. Some betrayals are private. Thomas moved out 2 days later. He packed quietly, efficiently, like someone who'd practiced leaving before. He took his clothes, his laptop, a framed photo of Grace when she was little. He left behind the rest. "You don't want to hurt me," he said at the door. I met his eyes. That ship sailed. After he left, people began to notice. Neighbors asked polite questions. Friends hesitated before speaking. Grace stopped answering his calls. Emily sent me a long message I didn't read. The truth leaked out anyway. It always does. At the grocery store, a woman I knew from PTA stared at me with a mixture of pity and curiosity. At work, a coworker hugged me too tightly. Word traveled fast in a town that pretended it didn't gossip. Thomas's life began to fracture. Emily wanted more. Grace wanted nothing to do with him. His colleagues started treating him differently once the rumors reached work. And Lily, sweet, innocent Lily, was caught between adults who had failed her before she even knew the words for it. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It was addressed to me in careful handwriting. Inside, Emily apologized. She said she didn't know Thomas was still married at first. She said she was tired. She said Lily asked for me. I folded the letter slowly and placed it in the drawer with the spare batteries and old instruction manuals. I wasn't ready to be generous yet, but I was ready to stop being quiet. The truth has a way of finding daylight, even when no one invites it out. I didn't announce Thomas's secret life. I didn't post anything online or make phone calls fueled by anger. But stories like ours don't stay contained. They seep through cracks. A comment here, a look there, until everyone knows enough to stop pretending. It started with Grace. She went back to college and told one friend. That friend told another. By the end of the week, Thomas's carefully built image, dependable husband, devoted father, had begun to crumble under the weight of reality. Not because Grace wanted revenge, but because she needed someone to say out loud that she wasn't crazy for feeling betrayed. Thomas noticed the shift almost immediately. His calls came more often. His tone changed, less defensive, more anxious. "They're treating me differently at work," he said one evening. "People are whispering." "I imagine they are," I replied. "This isn't fair," he snapped. "My personal life shouldn't matter." "It mattered when you were using company travel as an excuse to disappear," I said calmly. He fell quiet. At church, the place Thomas still attended out of habit more than faith, the smiles became tighter, the questions more pointed. Someone asked how Grace was doing, and when he hesitated before answering, the silence did the rest of the talking. Emily felt it too. She told me later that parents at Lily's preschool stopped inviting her to playdates, not out of cruelty, but confusion. Adults don't know how to act around complicated truths. They back away instead. Thomas tried to control the narrative. He told people it was a separation gone wrong. He said we'd drifted apart years ago. He implied I'd known more than I had. That's when I spoke up. Not loudly, not emotionally. Just once. At a small neighborhood gathering, someone I trusted asked me directly what had happened. I told the truth in plain language. No embellishment, no bitterness. He had another child and another home. I found out by accident. The room went quiet. No one argued with me. After that, the pretending stopped. Thomas stopped coming to gatherings. He transferred departments at work. The apartment he'd hidden behind became his permanent address. Emily didn't move in with him like he'd promised. She said she needed space. She said trust didn't rebuild just because lies were exposed. Grace refused to see him. "She doesn't owe me forgiveness," he told me once, voice thick. "No," I agreed. "She doesn't." The divorce finalized in early spring. I stood alone outside the courthouse afterward, the air crisp and clean, the sky impossibly blue. I expected to feel hollow. Instead, I felt steady, like I had finally put something heavy down. Thomas approached me hesitantly. "He never meant to hurt you." I believe that. But intention doesn't erase impact. He nodded, tears in his eyes. For the first time, he looked like a man facing the consequences of his choices without somewhere else to run. That was his work now. Mine was living. I redecorated the house slowly, deliberately. I moved furniture, donated clothes, painted the bedroom a softer color. I planted herbs in the backyard and watched them take root. Grace came home more often. We cooked together, talked late into the night. Sometimes we didn't talk at all, just existed in the same space, healing in parallel. One afternoon, a small envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a child's drawing, a stick figure family, uneven and earnest. Lily had written her name in careful block letters at the bottom. Emily's note was brief. "She wanted you to have this. I hope that's okay." I sat at the table and cried, not from pain this time, but from something closer to acceptance. I didn't know what role Lily would play in my life, if any, but I knew one thing. I wouldn't be part of the lie, and that felt like freedom. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in small, unremarkable moments, the kind you don't notice until you realize they've been happening for a while, like waking up without that familiar heaviness in my chest, or making dinner for one and not feeling lonely, or laughing with Grace without the shadow of her father hovering between us. Spring softened into summer. The house changed with the season. Windows stayed open longer. Sunlight stretched across the floors in the late afternoons. I bought new sheets, pale blue, crisp and cool, and slept diagonally across the bed like I'd never allowed myself to before. Thomas faded into the background of my daily life. We spoke occasionally, usually about paperwork or Grace. Our conversations were polite, careful. The anger I once carried toward him had burned itself down to something quieter, a dull understanding of who he was and who he wasn't capable of being. Emily and I kept a respectful distance, but Lily remained. Not physically, not yet, but emotionally. She existed in my thoughts more than I expected. Sometimes I caught myself wondering if she liked apples or oranges better, if she was shy at school, if she knew how complicated the adults around her were. One afternoon, months after the divorce, Emily asked if we could talk. We met at the same playground as before. Lily played nearby, her laughter drifting toward us on the warm breeze. I noticed how carefully Emily watched her, the vigilance of a woman who had learned not to rely too heavily on anyone else. "She asks about you," Emily said quietly. I nodded. "I think about her too." "She knows you're connected," she continued. "She just doesn't understand how." I took a deep breath. "Neither do I." Emily smiled faintly. "I don't expect anything. I just wanted to be honest." That honesty, the thing Thomas had withheld for so long, felt like a gift. We agreed to take things slowly, to let Lily lead with her curiosity, to answer questions truthfully but gently. The first time Lily and I shared a conversation, it was brief and awkward and perfect in its own way. She showed me a drawing. I told her I liked her shoes. She asked why I had the same eyes as her daddy. I said families can look like all sorts of things. She seemed satisfied. Grace took longer. When I told her I'd met Lily, she went quiet. Then she surprised me. "She didn't ask for any of this," she said. "No," I agreed. "Neither did we." She came with me the next time. She didn't say much to Lily, just smiled, offered her a juice box. But later that night, Grace admitted something she hadn't said before. "I think I was angrier at the lie than at her," she said. That felt like progress. Not forgiveness, not closure, but movement. I found myself again in ways I hadn't expected. I took a writing class at the library, started walking in the mornings, reconnected with a friend I'd lost touch with years ago because Thomas didn't care for her bluntness. I learned to sit with discomfort without rushing to fix it. One evening, while folding laundry, I found Thomas's old sweater tucked in the back of the closet. For a moment, the smell of his cologne pulled me backward to early mornings, shared coffee, a life that had once felt solid. I folded the sweater neatly and donated it the next day. Letting go doesn't always require ceremony. Sometimes it's just choosing not to carry what no longer belongs to you. On the anniversary of the night the key fell onto my kitchen floor, I stood alone in that same space. The kettle whistled, the window fogged, everything looked the same. But I wasn't. I picked up my keys, just mine, and felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing exactly what each one opened. I picked up my keys, just mine, and felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing exactly what each one opened. Some nights, when the house is especially quiet, I think about how close I came to never knowing. If that key hadn't slipped from Thomas's pocket, if I'd been too tired to hang up his coat, if I'd chosen comfort over curiosity again, I might still be sitting at that same kitchen table wondering why love felt thinner every year, making excuses for missed birthdays, teaching my daughter, without meaning to, that women are supposed to accept half-truths if they want peace. That thought still unsettles me. We talk a lot about betrayal, as if it arrives all at once, a loud explosion, a single moment that changes everything. But the truth is quieter. It's cumulative. It's built from small decisions made again and again, each one easier than the last. Thomas didn't wake up one morning and decide to destroy our family. He just kept choosing the path that asked the least of him in the moment, and I kept choosing patience, hoping it would eventually be rewarded. That's the part I had to forgive myself for. I had loved him honestly. I had believed him without needing proof. That wasn't weakness. That was faith. Misplaced, yes, but not shameful. The year after the divorce taught me more about strength than the 23 years of marriage ever had. Strength, I learned, isn't loud. It doesn't need witnesses. It looks like sitting with discomfort instead of rushing to smooth it over. It looks like telling the truth once and letting it stand on its own. It looks like choosing dignity even when anger would feel easier. Grace grew into herself during that time. She became sharper, more intentional. She stopped apologizing for having boundaries. Watching her unlearn the patterns she'd absorbed from our marriage was both painful and reassuring. Sometimes she still asks questions about her father, not accusatory ones, just curious. I answer honestly, without bitterness. I don't protect his image anymore, but I don't poison it either. That balance took time. As for Lily, life has a strange way of weaving threads you never planned to hold. She sends me drawings now and then. We meet occasionally. Ice cream, a park bench, conversations about school and favorite colors. I'm not her mother. I never will be. But I am a steady presence, and that feels like enough. Emily and I remain careful, respectful. There's an understanding between us, born not of friendship, but of shared truth. Neither of us lets Thomas rewrite the past anymore. He's learning to live with that. And I'm learning to live without resentment. People sometimes ask if I'd take him back if he begged. The answer surprises them. No. Not because I hate him, not because I want punishment, but because I know now that love without honesty is just loneliness with company. I don't want that life again. My days are quieter now, but they're fuller. I wake up knowing where I stand. I go to bed without rehearsing conversations that will never happen. I celebrate birthdays with people who show up, even if the guest list is smaller. And when I look at my keys, the real ones, the honest ones, I feel something close to pride. Because every door they open leads to a life I chose with open eyes. So I'll leave you with this, the question I asked myself long after the shock wore off. If you found the key, would you follow it? Or would you put it back, lock the door to the truth, and tell yourself that love is supposed to hurt this much? If this story felt familiar, if it touched something tender in you, You're not alone, and you're not weak for wanting answers. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is listen to the quiet moment when something inside us says, "This doesn't add up." Would you have done what I did? Tell me in the comments. Time doesn't heal everything the way people like to promise. What it does is give you space. Space to see your life clearly without the fog of constant reaction. Space to notice which wounds are closing on their own and which ones need tending. A year passed, then another. The house settled into its new rhythm. The creak on the third stair was still there. The window over the sink still rattled when the wind came from the east, but the air felt lighter, as if something heavy had finally been carried out and set down somewhere far away. Grace graduated. I sat in the auditorium with my hands folded in my lap, watching her walk across the stage with that same determined tilt of the chin she'd had since she was 5. When she looked out into the crowd and found me, she smiled. Not the polite smile she gives strangers, but the real one, the one she saves for safety. Thomas wasn't there. He sent flowers instead. Grace thanked him by text. She didn't invite him to dinner afterward. That choice was hers, and I didn't try to soften it. One of the hardest lessons for me had been learning that protecting someone from the consequences of their actions isn't kindness, it's interference. After the ceremony, Grace squeezed my hand and said, "You didn't break us." I didn't realize until that moment how deeply I'd feared that I had. Lily started first grade. She lost her first tooth, learned to ride a bike, began to read signs out loud while we drove, her voice full of pride. Sometimes she asked questions that stopped me short, about families, about why some people live in different houses, about why adults sometimes look sad even when they're smiling. I answered the best I could, not with stories that made things neat and easy, but with truth that fit her age. Children don't need perfection. They need honesty they can grow into. Emily and I found a strange equilibrium. We weren't friends, we weren't enemies. We were two women doing our best not to let one man's poor decisions define the rest of our lives. That mutual understanding mattered more than warmth. As for Thomas, distance changed him, or maybe it just revealed who he'd always been. He became quieter, less certain. He stopped trying to explain himself and started listening more. Once, over coffee, he admitted something he'd never said before. He said, "I didn't think I'd get caught, and I didn't think it would cost me this much." I didn't respond right away. "Sometimes," I said finally, "we confuse getting away with something for getting what we want." He nodded. That was the closest we came to closure. I didn't rebuild my life in dramatic ways. I didn't move across the country or change my name or fall into a sweeping romance that fixed everything. I rebuilt it in the quiet margins, in routines chosen consciously, in friendships that asked nothing of me but presence, in mornings where I woke up calm instead of braced. I learned what my peace sounded like. It sounded like no explanation needed, like laughter that didn't trail off into worry, like silence that felt restful instead of tense. There are still moments, grocery store aisles, certain songs on the radio, that tug at old memories. I let them. Grief doesn't need to be fought to be survived, but it no longer runs the house. The key sits in a small wooden box now, tucked in the back of a drawer. I didn't throw it away. I didn't keep it out of bitterness either. I kept it as a reminder, not of betrayal, but of awakening, of the moment I chose to stop doubting myself. Because the hardest part of that year wasn't discovering Thomas's second life. It was accepting how long I'd ignored the quiet voice inside me that already knew something was wrong. If there's a lesson in all this, one worth passing on, it's this. Pay attention to what keeps asking for your attention. Discomfort isn't always danger. Sometimes it's information. Sometimes it's your intuition knocking, gently at first, then louder, asking you to look at what you've been avoiding. You don't have to burn your life down to listen. You just have to be willing to tell yourself the truth. I did, and on the other side of that truth, I found something steadier than the life I lost. I found myself. After the confrontation, the house felt empty, even though he was still here. It's strange how betrayal changes the spaces you once felt safe in. I could hear the hum of the fridge in the kitchen, the tick of the living room clock, but every sound was magnified by tension. Even the curtains looked different, like they were watching me, waiting for my next move. I spent that night in the guest room, lying awake on the bed he once made for me in the early days, the nights when love felt easy and simple. I remembered our first apartment together, how he held my hand like he'd never let go, promising loyalty and lifelong partnership. And now, all of that had collapsed into a stack of lies and keys to another woman's apartment. The next morning, I didn't say a word to him. He tried to start small talk about breakfast, about the day ahead, but I only nodded. My mind was elsewhere, replaying the confrontation, the confession, the way his face shifted from guilt to panic to a faint plea for understanding. I realized that forgiveness wouldn't come easily. Not today, not tomorrow, and maybe not ever. But I also knew that anger alone wasn't enough. I needed clarity, a plan, a path that would let me reclaim my life without completely losing myself in bitterness. It started with evidence. I needed to know the full scope of what he had been doing, how long this had been going on, and whether there was more that I hadn't discovered. The apartment key was a tangible clue, but I knew that behind every secret, there were layers. I had to peel them back carefully. I began with research cautiously. No one else could know. My pride and dignity wouldn't allow it. I logged into his online accounts when he was in the shower, checking emails and messages that I hadn't had access to before. Every small discovery felt like a punch to the gut. Dinner reservations, receipts for flowers I never received, text messages that started sweet and ended with casual intimacy. The more I uncovered, the more I understood that this wasn't a fleeting mistake, it was deliberate. And the other woman wasn't just an acquaintance or a coworker, she was someone he had meticulously built a parallel life with. By the end of the week, I had compiled everything into a neat little folder. Photographs, screenshots, receipts, the spare apartment key, and a log of his movements. I wanted to confront him again, but this time with undeniable proof. I wasn't interested in denial or excuses. I wanted him to understand that I had already seen the truth, that no lie could hide him anymore. When I finally sat him down, the air was heavy with tension. I laid everything out, one piece at a time, watching the color drain from his face as I spoke. He tried to interrupt, tried to twist things, but I held my ground. This wasn't about anger, it was about clarity, about drawing a line in the sand. I know everything, I said, calmly, almost too calmly. The apartment, the messages, the receipts. I don't need your explanations. I don't need apologies. I need to know what you want to do next, because I have to decide how to live my life, with or without you. He slumped into the chair, defeated. For the first time, he seemed smaller than me, not because I was stronger, but because the weight of his choices had finally caught up with him. The man who had seemed so confident in his lies was now just a figure of regret. I left the house that afternoon, walking through the neighborhood I had always known so well. The air smelled like rain, damp and fresh, and the city hummed around me in familiar rhythms. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of calm. Not happiness, not yet, but a sense that life could be rebuilt. That evening, I went to the apartment. The key still fit. I opened the door slowly, cautious, almost reverent. The space was neat, impersonal, but it held the energy of someone else's life intersecting with mine. I walked from room to room, taking in the evidence of a world he had tried to hide from me. A vase on the counter, a scarf tossed on the sofa, a coffee mug with lipstick smudges. Every detail told a story I didn't want to hear but needed to understand. And then I saw the pictures on the wall. Photos of him and her, laughing, smiling, holding hands in ways that once belonged to me. I felt a wave of grief, but it wasn't pure anger. It was mourning, mourning the trust that had been broken, the love that had been betrayed, the life that had shifted irrevocably. I stayed there for hours, sitting on the sofa, letting the silence fill me. By the time I left, I had made a decision. I wouldn't chase revenge, and I wouldn't crumble. I would reclaim my life, my dignity, and my future. The next day, I filed for separation. I spoke to a lawyer, arranged our finances, and began the painful but necessary task of disentangling our lives. Every conversation was difficult, every decision heavy with emotion, but with each step, I felt a little more like myself again. And then, one morning, I realized something important. I had survived. Not just survived, but learned. I had learned to see the signs, to trust my intuition, to place my own well-being above deception and false loyalty. I had learned that love should never come at the cost of respect and honesty. Weeks later, he moved out, carrying the remnants of his other life. The apartment that had once been our home felt quiet, but no longer empty. I began to reclaim the space for myself, painting, rearranging furniture, letting in light. It was a small but significant act of healing. I even visited the other apartment once more, turning the key in the lock one last time just to remind myself of the closure I had achieved. I left the door open behind me, letting the past breathe out, making room for a future that was truly mine. I never spoke to her. There was no need. Her presence was irrelevant. The lesson had already been learned. The truth had already been faced. My focus was on my own growth, my own peace. And in that quiet reclamation of life, I found strength. I found resilience. I found the realization that no betrayal, no deception could ever truly define me. Only I could define myself. And I chose honesty, dignity, and self-respect. The weeks after he left were strangely quiet. At first, the silence felt oppressive, almost like the walls were echoing with his absence. But gradually, I began to notice the little things I'd taken for granted, the way sunlight pooled on the kitchen floor in the mornings, the soft hum of the city outside, the aroma of fresh coffee as I brewed it for myself. Life was different now, but in a way, it felt cleaner, more honest. I threw myself into routines that I had neglected during the chaos. The small pleasures that had once been background noise now became moments of meditation. I started cooking meals I enjoyed, rather than the hurried dinners we had shared. I began reading again, sinking into stories that didn't involve betrayal, stories that reminded me of the world beyond my own pain. One afternoon, I found myself at the local park, sitting on a bench under the bare branches of an old oak tree. The winter air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of earth and pine. Children ran past, their laughter ringing like tiny bells, and I smiled softly, almost absent-mindedly. For the first time in months, I felt like a spectator of life, not a victim caught in someone else's choices. I threw myself into therapy shortly after the separation. At first, I was hesitant. How could anyone truly understand the mix of grief, anger, and betrayal I carried? But my therapist's calm presence, the way she allowed me to unravel without judgment, became a kind of sanctuary. In those sessions, I spoke about the apartment key, the secret messages, the late-night whispers on the phone. I spoke about the suffocating sense of being deceived in the life I thought I knew. And slowly, I began to notice changes. I no longer replayed the confrontation in my head every morning. I could breathe without the tight knot of anxiety pressing against my chest. I even started dreaming again, not nightmares of deceit, but real dreams about the future I wanted to build. One day, while organizing the living room, I stumbled upon a small, forgotten notebook. His handwriting sprawled across its pages. It was filled with plans, lists, and casual notes, some of which revealed just how intentional his deception had been. I didn't throw it away immediately. Instead, I carried it to the balcony, sat with it in my lap, and for a long time, I simply stared at the horizon. It struck me then, the betrayal had taught me more about myself than about him. I had discovered my limits, my instincts, and my resilience. I realized that I had survived not because of luck, but because I refused to let someone else's choices dictate my worth. I began reconnecting with friends I had drifted away from. There were hesitant dinners at first, the kind where conversation was cautious and laughter fragile, but over time the warmth returned. We talked about everything except him, the vacations we'd missed, the small victories at work, the ordinary beauty of our shared lives. Those connections reminded me that I was never truly alone, even when it felt like I had been isolated by deceit. Financial independence became another focus. With the separation finalized, I worked with my lawyer to ensure that the division of assets was fair. There were moments of frustration and tension, but I refused to be intimidated. Every document signed, every account settled was a step toward reclaiming autonomy. I felt empowered in a way I hadn't before, an unexpected gift from a painful experience. And then, one evening, the phone rang. It was my son. "Mom, can we talk?" he asked, his voice hesitant, cautious. I swallowed a lump in my throat. My son had always been close to me, but the tension between him and his father had left a shadow over our relationship. "Of course," I said. "Come over." When he arrived, I could see the weight he had been carrying, the worry, the uncertainty. We sat together at the kitchen table, the same one where I had discovered the key, and he looked me in the eye. "You know things have been complicated, and I just want you to know that I'm here for you. I don't blame you for anything." Tears sprang to my eyes, but I blinked them back. I wanted to hold on to my composure, to let him see strength, not vulnerability. "Thank you," I said softly. "I appreciate that, and I'm proud of you too for how you've handled everything." We talked for hours that night, about life, about the future, about mistakes and forgiveness. There was no talk of him, my ex-husband, but that was okay. The focus was on rebuilding, on the bond that had never truly broken, even in the midst of betrayal. The next morning, I walked to the small cafe around the corner. I had begun spending time there, writing in my journal, reflecting on the journey I had endured. The barista greeted me warmly, offering a cup of coffee just the way I liked it. I smiled, realizing that these simple human interactions were the building blocks of my healing. Later that week, I met someone new, not in a rushed, I need to replace him kind of way, but in a gentle, natural manner. A colleague, a neighbor, someone whose presence was comforting, not demanding. We spoke slowly, exchanged ideas and small jokes, and I felt the tentative stirrings of trust, not the blind trust of the past, but the cautious optimism of someone who had learned from life's harsh lessons. At home, I began to paint, not masterpieces, but small, colorful canvases that filled the apartment with life and energy. Each stroke of the brush was a release, a reclaiming of my space, my identity, my joy. I painted flowers, skies, and sometimes abstract swirls of color that reflected emotion rather than form. The apartment, once a symbol of deceit, had become my sanctuary. And through it all, I kept the apartment key, not as a reminder of betrayal, but as a symbol of survival, a key that had unlocked pain, yes, but also clarity, a key that reminded me of what I refused to tolerate and of the power I had to shape my own story. I began speaking to close friends about my experience, cautiously at first, then with more confidence. The story of the key, the apartment, and the lies resonated with them, not because of the scandal, but because of the resilience it represented. I realized that sharing my journey wasn't about shame, it was about strength, about the lessons learned and the life reclaimed. The seasons changed outside my windows. Spring came, bringing blossoms and new scents, and I felt the same renewal inside. I walked through the park, inhaling the crisp air, watching children play, couples stroll, and strangers smile at one another. Life was moving forward, and so was I. By the time the first anniversary of his departure came around, I didn't feel sadness. I didn't even feel anger. I felt relief, gratitude, and a deep understanding of myself. The betrayal had been painful, yes, but it had also been a catalyst, a turning point that allowed me to rediscover who I was, what I wanted, and what I would no longer tolerate. I hung a small key-shaped charm on my bookshelf, not the apartment key itself, but a symbol of it, a reminder that pain can teach, that betrayal can clarify, and that even in the darkest moments, there is a path back to light. And as I stood by the window that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of pink and gold, I whispered to myself, I survived. I am whole, and I will never forget the lesson this key has given me.